Okay, I'm going to start promptly at 3 o'clock because I think these slides will take a while to get through. So welcome everyone to this talk on IND forms, updates and best practices. I'm Daniel Tonkin. I'm a regulatory affairs scientist at the Office of Regulatory Affairs Quality here at Duke. So thanks everyone who came, and those who are online. If you're doing the WebEx, you can ask questions through the Q&A, and someone will try and relay them to me. So I'm going to get underway. So, as I said, we're at the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality at Duke. We provide regulatory consultation for investigators at Duke who are doing clinical research and developing drugs, biologics, and medical devices. We support submissions of INDs and help with meetings for pre-INDs and pre-subs for devices, and we'll support with submissions of INDs and device applications. Yeah. Okay, and we also provide regulatory education events like this, and we have a training program. All that's on our website. We also have a quality assurance staff who support some of the GMP manufacturing here on campus. So before we get started, those who've had seminars with us before, we sometimes use these interactive quiz questions. If you go to this website, you can respond to the questions on your phone or on your laptop and help kind of quiz yourself on how to fill out these forms. So the address is here, polev.com/DukeU. If you can navigate to there, so you'll be ready when the first one comes up. Giving people a second to get there. There'll be one, I'll remind you later on at the first question. Okay. So, if you're here, you probably know what an IND is, since we're talking all about IND forms, but I'll just review quickly. An IND stands for Investigational New Drug Application. It's a request for authorization from the FDA to administer an investigational drug or biologic to humans, and it's specific for one drug or drug combination and one indication. And the application contains information on the manufacturer, on animal data, and on the clinical protocol and the investigator. So there's two types of INDs, and this comes up on the 1571, the first form, so we'll come back to this, but there can be commercial INDs where you're trying to obtain marketing approval of the drug, and there's also research or non-commercial INDs, which in an academic institution like Duke, a lot of them are research INDs. They're more where the goal is publication, not commercialization. So I'll just review some definitions. For an IND, there's always a sponsor and an investigator. The sponsor is the individual company, academic institution, or other organization that takes responsibility for and initiates the clinical investigation. And then there's also has to be at least one investigator. There's an investigator for each clinical trial site, who's an individual who conducts the clinical trial and under whose immediate direction the drug is administered or dispensed. And at an academic institution, a lot of the INDs, it's the same person as the sponsor and investigator, so we refer to them as a sponsor investigator. They initiate and conduct the investigation. So we're going to talk about the three main forms that are required for submission and maintenance of INDs, the Form 15, FDA 1571, 1572, and 3674. And I'll going to talk about what each of these is as we go through them. So I'm going to, well first, to find these forms, it's always good if you're preparing these forms that you check that you're using the most current version of the form. The forms have expiration dates on them, but you shouldn't always count on that. Sometimes the forms are revised before you reach the expiration date, or sometimes they go past the expiration date before the FDA will revise them. There's a URL here that shows you can navigate to the FDA, and they have a search engine to find these forms. I mean, usually you can Google it and just find it, but there is some risk that you might pull up the wrong version of the form. So the best approach is to go directly to the FDA website here. And there's also at the same website, there's instructions for each form. So that's, of course, where I got a lot of the material and our office's understanding of the best practices for completing these forms comes from these instructions. 2 of the forms also have FDA guidances that I'll refer to. So first, the Form 1571, this is the form's called the Investigational New Drug Application, and it's the cover sheet for all submissions to an IND, so use it for the initial submission, and then all amendments, you always have to include a 1571. So this is just kind of what it looks like zoomed out. You can't see the details here. I'm sure most of you have seen this, and so I'm going to just talk through each field and kind of talk about things to consider when filling out each field of the form and what they mean as we go through it. Okay, so field 1 is the name of the sponsor. So this is the same definition I just showed you for who the sponsor is, the person who takes responsibility for and initiates the clinical investigation. So if it's an investigator-initiated trial, it's the sponsor investigator physician, but it can also be it might not be an individual, it could be the company, and sometimes even in academia there's you might be maintaining an IND in academia, but supporting someone who's starting a company that is still at a point where the trial's happening here at Duke, if you're at Duke, and the sponsor might be the company that they're starting. So the field 2 is the date of submission. Just try and coordinate ahead of time so that this is actually going to be accurate to the date you actually submit the IND or IND amendment. If our office is supporting you with this, coordinate with our office to make sure that the date is right, and it should match the submission date on the cover letter. Yes? Should be the date we send it or the date you receive it? Always do the date we send it. Okay, and then field 3 is the sponsor address and telephone number. So whoever you put in field 1, there should be an address and phone number for them. And in the example I put here, I put a Duke box number. The FDA does, in the instructions, they say if you use a box number that there should be a street address as well. And it's also important that whatever address you use, that it's something that can receive U.S. mail, because the FDA does send some documents by U.S. mail. So so if you're using like an internal box number, make sure it's something that U.S. mail will arrive at. Okay, and then field 5 is the name of the drug or drugs. So here's where you put all the drugs or biologics that are under investigation in the study. And the instructions ask that if the drug has multiple names, you should use both the trade and generic names, and if any other names there may be. And and they say if there's multiple, okay, I got it. If there's multiple dosage forms, indicate which form. So like if it's some drugs can be administered as an injection or a tablet or whatever. So you can see in my example, I had Zofran as the trade name, and ondansetron's like the generic name, and same for Opdivo and nivolumab. For Zofran, I put that it's an oral solution because there's multiple versions of the dosage forms. The Opdivo is always injection, so I didn't put that, but you could put it there. The instructions also say something about including a unique ingredient, I forget exactly the acronym, but it's unique ingredient identifier. Our office never submits that. I think it's available for some drugs. It's like a chemical society thing that there's this number there, so they ask that you include that, but usually we don't. But it would be, if you know it, then include it. So in 6A is the IND number. So for an initial submission, this is usually going to be blank because you haven't been assigned an IND number, but sometimes for an initial submission, you may already have an IND number. If you have a pre-IND with CDER, they assign you a pre-IND number, which will also be your IND number. If it goes to CBER, your pre-IND number is different and wouldn't be used. And you can also request an IND number ahead of time if you want to. So it's a 6-digit number. Also, the IND numbers from CBER, I think, are still 5 digits long, but you should precede it with a 0. And then you can see the next choice, 6B, is that commercial versus research. So I'll kind of go through that more now. The instructions indicate you should select commercial IND if the product under investigation is intended to be commercialized at a later date. And the important thing to consider here is that if you do check commercial, then the FDA requires that this be an electronic submission, and I think a lot of you know this, but an electronic submission is actually, even though it sounds like in this day and age everything should be electronic, it is more, there's more formatting requirements, there's special software required. So our office is able to do electronic submissions. So if you're working with us, we can help you with that. If you're not working with our office, then there can be, it might be hard to do on your own. You might have to pay a publishing company, and there's expenses associated with that. So it does create some hurdles. But if you're planning to commercialize, then that's the approach you should, the box you should check and the approach you should use. So if it's a research IND, if you're not intending to commercialize the drug or biologic based on the research that you're doing there, then you check that box. Also, if you're doing an expanded access, i.e. compassionate use protocol or IND, then you can check research IND for that as well. So sometimes this is, it seems like a pretty easy binary decision, but sometimes it's harder or not as obvious as it seems. So in academia, there may be phase 1 trials that a sponsor investigator is doing where they have something new that they think might maybe of therapeutic value, and they're doing a phase 1 trial. Probably because they maybe want to commercialize it, so you probably should indicate commercial, but it's not. Sometimes it's not totally clear cut. And just recently, the FDA updated their instructions in the past few weeks and indicate that for phase 2 or 3 protocols, they say you should be always selecting commercial or else providing justification as to why the study is a research study. And I think partly this kind of shows that they realize that there may be phase 1 trials that are in that gray area, but and they say it's something like if it's an investigator who usually submits research INDs, but now is doing moving into phase 2, that kind of shows that they're not just doing research, that they're really trying to commercialize. But then they say for phase 2 or 3 protocols, you should check commercial or provide justification. So there are a lot of cases in academia, of course, where physicians are getting drugs from a drug company that's either a marketed drug or is further along in development by that drug company. And so the protocol is not considered a phase 1 trial because the drug company has already kind of gone through phase 1. And they're calling it a phase 2 trial, but it's still something that's more research for publication. So basically, you should, under the new instructions, there should be some sort of explanation in the cover letter explaining why this is phase 2 or 3, but it's still research if that's the case. Okay. Field 7A is the proposed indication for use, and if there's multiple indications for use in the trial, then you should use continuation pages because there's information you have to enter for each indication. So you just put your indication for use in this box here. In this case, I put multiple myeloma is my example indication. So it's the patient population or disease that this drug is going to be used with. And then you indicate if you have an orphan drug designation. So this is something you can apply for if there's prevalence of less than 200,000 people in the U.S. have this disease. You can apply for this designation, and it has benefits for marketing and sometimes for grant applications. So you either check yes, or if you have it, check yes, otherwise check no. And then if you have orphan drug designation, that means the prevalence should be less than 200,000. You should check yes. If you don't really know, it's probably okay to leave it blank, which is what I did here. But I try and fill it out if I know which it is. And if you have orphan drug designation, then there's a number you're assigned that you enter here. So 7B, this is the SNOMED CT indication disease term, and this was added about a year ago, so it's still relatively new. So SNOMED CT stands for Systematized Nomenclature of Medicine Clinical Terms, and it's a systematically organized, computer processable collection of medical terms, providing codes, terms, synonyms, and definitions used in clinical documentation and reporting. So there's a bunch of instruction on the instruction sheets. It's not intuitive to know what your SNOMED CT term is. So there's this 10-step instructions on the instruction sheets of how to find this. So I'm not going to talk through it all, and this is something I forgot to prepare ahead of time, but I'm going to go to my browser and kind of show you what to do. But you can always get an instruction sheet here and kind of see what to do. So try and get to the beginning. Okay, so and sometimes when you first go to this, it makes you like agree that yes, you agree to their terms. So when you go to this page, you can scroll down, and there's a bunch of there's like additions for different countries. So you go to the one that says United States and click on that, and that brings you to this page. And there's like a search box here where you can type in your condition, and the instructions say to click this little group by concept choice. I haven't experimented too much with what happens if you don't press it, but that's what the instructions say. And then you enter your term, your indication here. So my example one, as I said, is multiple myeloma. So you type it in and search, and it comes up with a bunch of choices here. You know, you can see sometimes it can be confusing. It's not clear which one to pick because there's two multiple myelomas, but this first one says something about there's no international classification, and the second one seems to just kind of be a more basic, no conditions. So you should choose the indication that's as specific as you can be. If it's a specific type of multiple myeloma, you could go down here. If it's indolent or smoldering or whatever, there's all kinds of different options. And you can consult with the physician if you need to get advice on that. But in this case, I am clicking on multiple myeloma there, and then information comes up over here. And you're not done yet. There's all these different tabs here. So you click on expression, and then you get these SNOMED CT numbers, and you want the one that says pre-coordinated expression. So then that's what you copy and paste. You copy it and put it in your 1571. So it's a bit of a process, and we're gonna. And there's an FDA presentation out there where they talk about how you should choose there may be multiple terms that would apply to your study, but you should choose the one that's the most specific, which is what I said here. So I think there's going to be, and then this just shows the box where I pasted that in to my 1571. Okay, so get out your phones and laptops if you're going to participate in the practice quizzes. So these examples came from an FDA presentation that I stole. So if you're doing a study that has to do with hypertension, so all these choices fit your study, but which one is the most appropriate? So the first choice is hypertensive disorder, systemic arterial, hypertension and chronic kidney disease due to type 1 diabetes mellitus, hypertension and chronic kidney disease stage 2 due to type diabetes mellitus. Okay. So you can see, so most people are picking the first one, but the answer I was going for and the FDA was going for is the third because it's the most specific. This is kind of general. A is kind of general, hypertensive disorder, systemic, whereas when you get down to the third option, you can basically it's a longer explanation. It's not just hypertension, it's in chronic kidney disease stage 2 due to type 2 diabetes mellitus, so it's very specific. I mean, there's not always that specific of an option, or it may not be the case in your study, but that's the recommendation. Okay, so fields 8, 9, and 10. Field 8 is the phase of clinical investigation, and this, as you saw, this now has implications on whether you're calling this, potentially has implications on whether you're calling something commercial or research. But you just check what the protocol, what phase of protocol it is. So, and if it's like, here I checked phase 1 and 2 because sometimes protocols are phase 1/2, so you can check both options that apply. And then field 9 is space for cross-reference. Sometimes in your IND you're cross-referencing information in other INDs or in drug master files. So if you are doing that, then you just include that IND number or DMF number in that space, as many of them as there are, and put it in there. Just so that helps the FDA easily know that they're going to need to reference that to review your application or amendment. And then the serial number goes here. So for initial submissions, it's 0000. Did I say too many zeros? 4 zeros. And then it's 0001, 2, 3, 4. It just goes up numerically. Okay, field 11 this is where you put lots of choices here. It's multiple choice, and you're putting the purpose of the submission or purposes. So for initial IND, you're just going to check the first box, initial investigational new drug application. And then for all your amendments, you're not going to check that, and you're going to check other things, whatever happens to be in that submission. So in this example, like it could be a safety report, an IND safety report, as well as a protocol amendment. So you check that protocol box, but there's lots of choices. There's new protocol, new investigator, annual report, response to clinical hold, response to FDA request for information. There's choices for requests for meetings with the FDA or information amendments, which can be updates on manufacturing information or animal studies, various choices. So, okay. So this next quiz question is it was a tricky one for our office too, and we weren't all doing it the same way, but I thought it was useful to ask. So we haven't talked about 1572s, but I think most of you are familiar with them. So if you're updating your 1572 with new sub-investigators, which box is appropriate to check? And it's not surprising that people are putting different things. It's our office. Our office actually, I'll give people a minute. Some of this we're actually putting other in this. After talking about it, we kind of decided actually changing protocol was the most appropriate. When we get onto field 14, 1572 is listed under the protocol category, and the instructions say that a change in protocol relates to a change in the protocol itself or the investigators. It doesn't say sub-investigators, but we felt like that was the most appropriate. New investigator, we feel like applies more to not the sub-investigators. That's more if you have either a new investigator at a new site or the investigator at an existing site is changing to a new investigator. So it's just like the lead investigator. But yeah, it can be tricky. So that's what I just said. We promote not putting new investigator for an updating of 1572. We do use the other box for a lot of submissions as kind of free text. If you feel like all the other choices don't fit, you can say other. So it might fit for, these are just examples, an IND withdrawal, a letter of authorization, an updated 3674, you're transferring the IND to a different person, etc. So it can be used not infrequently.
We have a question on WebEx. Why are you submitting updated 1572s with sub-investigator changes and the PI has not changed? That's usually when the 1572 is updated.
Okay. If people online couldn't hear, they're asking why you would update a 1572 just to update sub-investigators. I believe the instructions do say they don't kind of give you a clear timeline, but they say when information on the 1572 changes that you should update that information with the FDA. So we do encourage updating any information that's changed on the 1572 sooner rather than later, not just the investigator. So yeah. Okay. And then field 12, this is where they ask if your IND relates to a combination product. So, I guess most often for most people it's no, but certainly sometimes it's yes. You might be testing a combination product. So if no, check no. If yes, indicate yes. And then there's choices, and you have to go to instruction sheet, which is on the next page, to indicate the type of combination product it is. And sometimes you can go to the Office of Combination Products at the FDA and submit a request for designation to determine which center at the FDA should be have oversight of your combination product. So if you did that, then you would have a request for designation number, and you would put that in that box. But otherwise, it would be blank. I put this URL here. I don't know if you have time to copy it down. The FDA just gives a bunch of examples there. But on the next slide, these are the choices that you can select from. There's nine choices for the type of combination products. So if you put 1, that means you have a convenience kit or co-package. 2 is a drug delivery device or system, so it could be like a syringe that's prepackaged with the drug already in it. Or 3 is a biologic in a delivery device system. 4 is a device coated with a drug. 4 is device coated with a biologic. 6 is a drug-biologic combination. 7 is if you have 2 products that require cross-labeling, so the labels would refer to each other, or a possible combination based on cross-labeling. And then 9 is other. So if you think you have a combination product, kind of look at these, and you can consult our office if you have questions. I have a example quiz question with all these choices. Hopefully you can see the font. But so what combination product code should you choose if you have a trial where that's designed to test an in vitro diagnostic? And remember, in vitro diagnostics are devices. I'll tell you that up front. And then and the result from that in vitro diagnostic testing would be required for the use of an investigational biologic. So you wouldn't be able to use, when the biologic's approved, it wouldn't be able to use unless there's a certain result from the in vitro diagnostic testing. So people are putting various things here, but I think the most frequent choice is the right one, 7. These are separate products that require cross-labeling, where the labels, if the diagnostic was approved and the biologic was approved, they would refer to each other. Okay, field 13 is for expanded access. So if your IND is not an expanded access IND, then you just leave it blank. But if it is a submission for expanded access, then you're going to indicate the size of the expanded access population. Over here on the right, there's it could be an individual patient non-emergency or an individual patient emergency. And if that's the case and it's a new protocol, then actually there's another form, which I'm not going to go through, the Form 3926, that you can use, and that's a simpler form. If you're at Duke, our office does these submissions most of the time, and all teams are encouraged to have us do this for them, and there's a request form on our website to do this. But otherwise, you can, so there's those choices, and there's also an intermediate size patient population or a treatment IND. So you check whichever one it is if you're doing expanded access, and then there's also 2 other boxes if for that expanded access use you want to either, first one is to waive informed consent for that person, and the second one is if you want to charge the patient for the use of that expanded access drug or biologic. Okay, so 14 is another big multiple choice one, contents of applications. So if you're doing a new IND, everything should be checked yes. So some sections in a new IND may be basically empty, but there'll still be a heading there that'll say like not applicable. So everything should be checked, particularly like biosimilar use fee or additional information might not be really contained, and some might just be cross-referenced, but check everything. So then when you have IND amendments, then you should always be checking the 1571 box, because there's always a 1571. And then you just choose from all the other options. And there may be, sometimes there won't be anything else if you're submitting like a 30, well, I feel like not 3674, but if it's like a withdrawal or something, there might not be, it might not, none of these choices might be relevant other than 1571. But like in this example, there's a protocol, a new protocol or a protocol amendment, so that's checked, and then if a 1572 was submitted. So whenever you submit a 1572, we recommend that you check box 6B, 6C, and 6D here, because all of those refer to the content on the 1572, even if you're only changing content in one section, the information is still being provided to the FDA in that 1572. So we always check all three. Uh-oh. This one already has some answers somehow. Okay, what box? So if you're submitting an annual report, and this one you can put multiple answers, which boxes should always be selected for an annual report? And sometimes we do, I'll just say, occasionally annual reports, like if there have been no changes to the study, then sometimes it goes in as just a cover letter, but assuming you actually have a legitimate full annual report that's written up, what should be selected? So yes, of course, everyone checked 1571, and then our feeling, so the annual report contains a table of contents, an introductory statement, and the general investigational plan. So that's what so we always check those 4 options. And then these other things, sometimes you're submitting the current version of the protocol, you might check that, but it's not kind of the default. All right. How are we doing on time? Okay. So, and then in fields 15, 16, and 17, 15 is whether there's any contract research organizations involved. So for sponsor investigator, IND, usually there's not, but if the answer is yes, there are CROs involved, then there's continuation pages where you provide information on them. And then 16 and 17 are, for sponsor investigator, are usually the same. It's the name. 16 is the name and title of the person responsible for monitoring the investigation. So for sponsor investigator, that's who it's going to be. And the same for 17, the name and title of the person responsible for review and evaluation of information relevant to safety. So you end up putting this, often in academic trials, we're just putting the same name over and over. Yeah?
So for ECRI.
Yeah?
If ECRI is being doing
right. Someone's asking if DCRI, which is like a Duke CRO, is monitoring. Should they be put there? Possibly, yes? Yeah. Okay, that's the slide just kind of shows kind of standard sponsor investigator responses there. And then field 18 is the name of the sponsor or sponsor's authorized representative. So for a sponsor investigator IND, it's going to be the same person. If back in field 1, if the sponsor was like a drug company was the entity put in field 1, then there should be an actual individual here in field 18 who's the authorized representative for that IND. So sometimes it might be a different person from what you had back in field 1. And then there's the contact information for that person. So often it's the same information you had at the beginning, but if they're different, if it's a authorized representative, then it could be a different contact information. So this is just kind of showing what it looks like. For my example, it's all the same information. There's also fields for countersigner. This only is relevant if the person in field 18 is somebody outside of the United States. The sponsor is outside of the United States, then you need someone in the U.S. to be the countersigner. So we rarely encounter that, but it can happen. And then the person who signs the 1571 should be the same person whose name was here in field 18. And then you put the date over here. Yeah. So, so the person should either sign in ink or sign with like an Adobe digital signature. All right, so that's it. That's the 1571. Any questions before I move on? Okay. So 1571 is the statement of the investigator. It's an agreement signed by the investigator to provide certain information to the sponsor and assure that he or she will comply with FDA regulations related to the conduct of a clinical investigation of an investigational drug or biologic. So basically it's kind of the purpose of the 1572 is to provide information to the sponsor about the investigator and the clinical site. And thinking about this is more framed in terms of like a multi-site trial where you're collecting information from the different investigators at each site and information on those sites. If it's a sponsor investigator trial, it's kind of an agreement with with themselves because it's the same person. And 1572 also informs investigators of their obligations as an investigator for IND. So I'm just mentioning this here that there is, in addition to the instruction sheets, guidance for the Form FDA 1572. So there's more information there if you have questions after this. And this is the same list of sponsor versus investigator that we had before. So just remember that it's the investigator for that trial site and that protocol who's filling out the 1572. So who signs this form? If it's an industry-sponsored or other multi-site trial, then it's the investigator conducting the trial at that site. And I know that's what a lot of study teams here are doing for when when Duke is a clinical site for that, for some industry-sponsored study. They're completing the 1572 and providing it to the company, and the company handles the rest of the IND submissions. So for a sponsor-investigator trial, clearly the sponsor is the investigator. You know, sometimes in academic trials there may be an academic sponsor who assigns a different academic investigator to be the investigator at Duke or whatever site. So sometimes it's not the same person. And the instructions say the investigator, or the guidance I think say the investigator does not have to be a physician, but they should be qualified and have at least one clinical sub-investigator. Usually it is a physician, but it doesn't have to be. And then, so the regulations require that the sponsor collect the 1572 from each investigator. And then they're required to submit that information to the FDA. They're not required to actually submit the 1572 to the FDA. For some reason, that's the way they wrote the regulations, but the most efficient way is to just submit that 1572 rather than recreating it in another document. Okay. So another quiz question, and this one may have multiple answers as well. In what cases must a new 1572 be completed? So I'm asking you're not just updating an existing 1572, but you're creating a new 1572 that needs to be, that information needs to be sent to the FDA. Lots of answers coming up here. Kind of stabilizing. So if I can get this. I was actually going for, and these are in the instructions or guidance, I think guidance. The answer is A and B. So if you have a new investigator at a new site or just a change to a new investigator at an existing site, then you'll need a new 1572. And if you have a new protocol submitted to the same IND, then you also need a 1572 for that. So you can have multiple protocols under one IND. So you might have be the same investigator having a 1572, multiple 1572s under the same IND. Change in sub-investigators, you may be submitting a 1572, but it's not new, and that is more of an update. Yeah?
So you have to submit the information about, okay, our site's the sponsor, and we're collecting 1572 as a sponsor from our site.
Right.
We have to submit that information to the FDA.
Right.
Do we have to do that before? Does the FDA need that information before they can?
I think, so someone's asking if the FDA needs the information before enrollment starts. I feel like they need at least one 1572. I'm not sure how closely, I don't know. Does anyone on our staff have aware of the requirement, how they?
Yeah, so if you're adding a new investigator, you have
I guess you do.
30 days.
30 days,
to
yeah.
add that site to submit the 1572 to your IND.
Okay, right. Thanks, Erica.
Mm-hmm.
So online, if you didn't hear that, it is within 30 days of the new investigator being added that you have to send that to the FDA. Oop, hit the wrong thing. Okay. All right. So that's what I said here. So other changes like address, new sub-investigators, that has to be sent to the FDA at some point, preferably on the 1572. The timing is a little vague. Okay. So now we're going to start going through the actual document, the actual form. So field 1 is the name and address of the investigator. So, if you have, sometimes there's like multiple investigators and they may call themselves co-investigators. So you should identify a leader of the team to be the IND investigator. I think we have had cases where they just want to be equal co-investigators at the same site, in which case you would have to submit a 1572 for both investigators. But you don't need to be you're not putting sub-investigators in this field, just the lead investigator. And then their address information, and then in field 2, you should basically always check the CV choice, and then when you submit the 1572, you're providing the CV of the investigator, basically to show that they're qualified to be an investigator. Okay, field 3, not showing what it looks like, but this is sites of conduct of a clinical investigation, and there's continuation pages. There can be lots of sites. So the FDA lists kind of these examples of sites of conduct of clinical investigation. So there's the location where the drug is shipped. So we generally recommend putting usually that's the pharmacy, so usually you're going to have the pharmacy there. And then facilities where study activities will be conducted and clinical data will be generated. So that includes locations where subjects are seen, and where study procedures are performed, locations where drug is administered and or prepared, locations of sample collection. And it is kind of like a judgment call into like how specific you're going to be. Can you just kind of say it's happening at Duke University Medical Center and that's good enough? We kind of recommend you be a little more specific than that, but you don't have to like list every single room number either. So it is not always, or probably study teams may vary a little bit in what they include there. If an investigator is seeing subjects at multiple sites, list them all. So like, could be all within the Duke system, so you're considering it one clinical site, but it's some's at Duke here in Durham and some's at Duke Raleigh, so you would list both of those as clinical sites. And they point out if you are treating patients at home, you don't need to list people's home addresses. Yeah, Julie?
We're part of the oncology, so we're predominantly going to be the ones in the cancer center, but we might include North, we might include one
Right.
there.
Right.
We might even use someone in the regional if that's the only one that has availability if we need it. So how do we decide where do we draw the line?
Right. So someone's asking, like, yeah, if you're doing CT scans or MRIs, but sometimes you use them at various locations around the hospital or different hospitals even. That's hard.
Where we're attending and kind of our top choices, should we list every location in the CT scan?
Right. I mean, that does seem a little extreme. So I feel like generally it's would be reasonable to have your kind of intended CT scanner or whatever device it is and stick with that. But unless you find yourself maybe using another one on so much, maybe you decide it's appropriate. I know it's a hard choice, and it's hard to have a good answer. So then the next field 4, kind of similar idea, but here you're looking at where the clinical labs or testing are located. And these are clinical labs and testing facilities directly contributing to or supporting the clinical studies. So this could be PK labs, or there's usually labs supporting safety and efficacy of data, efficacy data. Duke, it's usually you're listing Duke clinical labs, and the instructions do clarify that you don't have to worry about Duke clinical labs. Maybe you may send all the blood or whatever samples to them, and they may like subcontract and ship out samples to a third party for certain specialty testing, and you don't need to worry about these satellite labs. It's all kind of under the umbrella of one lab. But do list the main lab. I know a lot of studies have like biomarker testing that's like exploratory, that might be happening in more of like a research lab setting. And the instructions aren't as clear, don't really address that. And it probably varies by study team. I think our feeling is that if it's really just kind of exploratory biomarker research, you probably do not need to list that here. But if anyone has any thoughts on that, let me know. And then field 5 is the name or address of the IRB, so I just listed the Duke IRB address. Usually there's just one IRB, but there could potentially be others that you would put on continuation pages, and or if you're using a third-party IRB, you'd put that instead. Okay, field 6 is names of sub-investigators, and I know this is always a challenging one as well, and I probably won't have a satisfactory answer, but the instructions for these are kind of the people on the study team who are considered sub-investigators are individuals who are directly involved with the performance of procedures required by the protocol and the collection of data. And then they say it does not include hospital staff or nurses or residents or fellows or office staff who provide ancillary or intermittent care but who do not make a direct and significant contribution to the clinical data. It also doesn't include, you don't have to put people on the 1572 because you expect them to be on a publication that's going to be associated. I think we've seen sometimes people feel that, but that's not the case. It's more just being directly involved in procedures and performance of the protocol. And that's so often, and if you're completing a 1572 for an external sponsor, sometimes their monitors may have their own kind of rules about who they want to see on your 1572, and so sometimes I know there's some push and pull with the site and the sponsor on who to put. So there's a question or a comment.
For the sub-investigator, when it says individuals involved directly with the data, collection of data and performance of procedures, so would you put the normal PI, and then would you also put the CRC and the research assistants, the people who are directly involved in all of that?
Right. The main investigator is up at the top, yeah. And then usually all the other physicians who are involved are going to be there. The instructions do say usually not pharmacists, usually yes, research coordinators, or at least the coordinator who's dedicated to that protocol. So coordinators, yes. I know it's usually nurses, and someone's shaking their head though. Maybe.
I just think in oncology we put the physicians, the PhDs, and our APPs.
Yeah.
Can we go further than that?
And I think with collection of data,
That's enough now.
Yeah, it can be a lot. It changes a lot.
The people who are doing the things listed in the schedule for events, because they're not actually getting the data, it's the investigators who are getting the data.
Right.
Then the coordinators are finding it.
Yeah.
And entering it into the database.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does mention that in the guidance, I think. They say research coordinators usually or probably or something like that. So, but I'm not telling you to change your practice necessarily. But I don't have it in front of me, but I think some teams do put research coordinators, right? Didn't they at the Brain Tumor Center? The primary coordinator. Yeah.
It says it's a matter of judgment, but usually you would put it in.
Yeah. The instructions say it's a matter of judgment, but usually, yes, research coordinator. So, I mean, that's maybe a compromise if there's a lead one and nobody, but don't list like all the ones on the team if there's a bunch. I know there's a lot of grief over this field. It's hard, and there's so many people you have to update it a lot because there's always change. Okay, but I'm going to go on. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm running out of time anyway. So, field 7, you put the protocol name and the protocol that 1572 applies. So I mentioned each protocol in an IND has its own. It's going to have 1572s for that protocol at each site. And a code number, just if sometimes there's a code number that goes along with the protocol. So if there is a code number, include that as well. So field 8, this one's easy. You just check the box corresponding with the trial phase. So for either phase 1 or phase 2 or 3. So if it's and they say if it's a phase 1/2 trial, go ahead and check the second box, phase 2. And then last is basically the fine print. This is what the investigator's agreeing to by signing the 1572, which I'm not going to read it all, but generally it's saying that they've received copies of, have read and understood the protocol and the investigator's brochure if there's one, and they're familiar with the regulations governing the conduct of clinical studies. So this, it's all this information here, which I'm not going to read. And then when you zoom out more, there's the commitments there, and there's also kind of instructions for that you need to complete this and provide the CV and sign-in date and then provide it to the sponsor. Good. So there's not too much time left for 3674, but it doesn't take too long, I think. So this form is required to certify your compliance with registering your trial on clinicaltrials.gov. So it has to accompany new INDs and new protocol amendments. If you're submitting a brand new protocol to an existing IND, then you would have a 3674 to go along with that new protocol. They are also submitted with things other than INDs, marketing applications, but we're just going to talk about doing it for an IND here. And just mentioning there is a guidance here. It seems like the formatting doesn't quite look like the typical FDA guidance, but it's still an official guidance, and there is a little more information here. So which clinical trials have to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov? It has to be registered if it's considered an applicable clinical trial. Down at the bottom, there's a checklist for applicable clinical trials and ACT. There's a checklist at clinicaltrials.gov that you can go through, but there's 4 things that have to apply. It's an interventional study. You're evaluating a FDA-regulated drug, biologic, or device. These would always apply if you have an IND. It's happening in the United States. And then it says it's phase 2 through 4. So, oh no, battery running though. Save me, Kelly. I'm going to keep going though. I forgot to plug in. So even if it's not, so if it's a phase 1 trial, here's a plug here. Here's one. Quick. All right. Cancel. Even if it's a phase 1 trial, usually you're going to be registering with clinicaltrials.gov and still submitting the 3674. So there's other reasons to register your trial. Usually the institution requires it because it's required for publication in most journals, and it's also required for anything that's funded by the NIH. So, and that includes phase 1 trials. So I'll just mention while we're at it that there are some different deadlines for registering trials. For an ACT, you're required to register within 21 days after enrolling the first patient, and has to be updated within 12 months, or every 12 months, and you have to report results within 12 months of the primary completion date. For journal publishing, you actually have to register earlier. You have to register before enrollment, and you're encouraged to report results. And for the NIH, it's the same requirement. So pretty much always you're going to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov if you have an IND. So quick question, so who should be signing the IND? Is it the sponsor or the investigator? It won't take too long because we have like 5 minutes left, but it's the sponsor, yes. You were right. The sponsor is the one signing the 3674. Okay. So this form's fairly straightforward. So fields 1 through 4, it's information for the IND sponsors. It's the same as what was on the 1571, basically, name, address, the date of that you're submitting, and the phone number. In field 5, you have the same kind of information there's a field for each drug or biologic that's being investigated under this IND. And then in field 6, 7, and 8, 6, for an IND, you're always going to be checking IND here, so you can see it applies for lots of other application types, but we're not going to talk about those. You put in the IND number, if you have it, and then the serial number. Normally it's a 4-digit number, but on the Form 3674, you have to put in a 5-digit number for the serial number for the submission. And then field 9 is where you indicate whether it is an applicable clinical trial, and I'll go through each of these choices separately. So box A is if there's no clinical trial in this application, so that would never be accurate for an IND. It could apply to like a 510K, which is a device clearance application, could have not had a clinical trial. Box B, you're saying it's not an applicable clinical trial. So as I said, usually it's going to be, if it's compassionate use, that is a case where it's not an applicable clinical trial, and in that case, you actually don't need to submit the 3674 anyway. So as I mentioned, it's officially not an applicable clinical trial if it's phase 1, but if we're registering with clinicaltrials.gov, we always still choose option C anyway. So that's pretty much always what we put, is that there is an applicable clinical trial. All right. And then in field 10 is where you put your clinical trial number that you have from clinicaltrials.gov, your NCT number. And there needs to be if box C is selected, you should have an NCT number to put there, except in your initial submission, IND submission, often you don't have a NCT number yet, so then you just have to leave it blank, and then when you do get your NCT number, once the trial's going, or around that time, but then you'll submit a 3674 that has NCT number, and when you type it in, don't type in the NCT prefix, just type the number, and then the NCT auto-populates on this form. And then fields 11 through 15 is the sponsor or sponsor's authorized representative, analogous to what was at the end of the Form 1571. So you have that person's name and address and contact number, and then you date it, and they sign it. That's it. So I think that's all. There's just some contact information for our office. So thanks for attending. Let me know if you have any last questions. Hopefully that was helpful.